Well, today is May the 4th. I could remind you of some grandiose historical event. Maybe, I don't know, this is the 111th anniversary of the birth of the Royal Canadian Navy, but seriously, the Canadian Navy? Come on. Today actually is the 91st anniversary of the birth of Audrey Hepburn. If you don't know who Audrey Hepburn is, please leave this channel. I do not want to talk to you. Now, following the video of yesterday, exploring the potential of the specs for 9.1, I wanted to look at them in a different way. Because, you know, sometimes there are some people, there are some rare specimen who do not really care too much which specs are going to be flavor of the month, which specs are going to be very powerful. You know, sometimes someone is going to be like, yeah, dude, I get it. Fire Mage is very strong. Yeah, okay, Unholy Death Knight is super powerful, and I'm gonna have a much better chance finding a spot in a raid or in a Mythic Plus group if I play Unholy Death Knight, but there's a problem. I fucking hate playing Unholy, or I just don't get the Fire Mage playstyle. I want to play something else. So for our episode of what to play in 9.1, instead of looking at simply who looks the strongest, let's look at other traits of these specs, something that could invite you or maybe push you away from playing certain specs. And today what we're looking at is how fast do they play? What is their APM, their actions per minute? Just how quickly do you have to press your buttons and keep track of all your abilities based on the spec you're playing? We will be looking probably maybe tomorrow or in a couple of days also at how fun, but because that is much more subjective, right? It's much more divisive between the player base. There are some gentlemen of questionable sanity who actually enjoy playing Frost Mage, but that's just someone's personal preference. So for now we're looking at something much more statistical, much more mathematical, which is just how quick do you have to act when you're playing certain specs, because there are some significant differences. Actually, some specs play as fast as twice as much as certain other specs. So it can be a major difference in your enjoyment of a spec. So let's start with a few caveats before going into the specs, because maybe not everyone knows about this, which is the fact that, number one, tanks, generally speaking, are going to have a much higher average APM than your fellow DPS spec. Obviously, tanks have to deal with active mitigation, which very often, for most specs, is going to be off the global cooldown. So it's not going to have to be cast every 1 or so seconds. You can just use it whenever. They also do not have to be balanced from Blizzard around doing damage, around giving them a compelling DPS rotation. So a lot of their filler abilities can be spammed much more freely than the filler ability of a DPS. There are many specs for DPS who are going to have filler abilities which are going to be able to be casted much less often because they are getting gated by things like energy, by things like runic power, whereas for tanks it doesn't happen as often. So yeah, generally speaking, if you're one of the slow types, if you're on the slow end, if you want to play a more laid back specs, tanks generally are not the answer. You won't find many chill and laid-back tanks if you want to play a pretty quiet spec. There is only one exception in the entirety of the tank roster, which is... I'm waiting. Death Knight. The answer is Death Knight. Blood Death Knight is the slowest of all the tanks. Blood Death Knight can cast even as little as 50% of the abilities that a couple of other tanks like Protection, Paladin and Brewmaster are going to be casting. Blood Death Knight is the tank that is gated the most by the resources. When you look at Blood Death Knight, the runic power and the runes are going to stop a lot of the things you want to do. Even the filler, something like Blood Boil, which could give them a nice spammable ability as a cooldown, as a recharge rate, so you can't spam that. You have, of course, Heart Strike, which is going to cost runes, and you have Death Strike, which is going to cost runic power, so you cannot spam them. This makes the spec pretty slow. Doesn't have too much to cast, doesn't have too many alternative buttons to cast, so it's a pretty slow spec. Very in line, we can say, with how it functions. I guess probably this was the intention of Blizzard. DK is very slow, is very immobile, a slow, lumbering hunk of metal. It seems like they wanted to follow it up with a similar playstyle in how they actually click and use their abilities. Now, I already spoiled you which are the fastest of the tank specs. In the middle of the pack, you have Guardian Druid, you have Protection, Warrior, and you have Vengeance, Demon Hunter. Middle of the pack for a tank still means you're going pretty fast in your ability usage compared to melee DPS and range DPS. You're still pretty fast. The exception, kind of, to this rule is for Guardian Druid. Guardian Druid, when you look at something like this, you're like, Hold on a second. Since when does Guardian use Shred, or Rake, or Rip? Guardian Druid can actually go to be one of the most consistent and highest ability user of the tanks because they can change forms. So yeah, Guardian Druid can be gated by something like Rage. The fact is that Guardian Druid can also switch into cat form and start using energy instead. This is very prevalent in raids, and it requires a little bit more tinkering, a little bit more experience of Mythic Plus keys to be able to pull this off, but in raids it's much easier. In raids, your tank is going to take aggro off you whenever you have to tank swap, taunt swap, which means you're free. You're not taking much of any damage whenever there isn't an ad or someone else hitting you, or maybe the boss doing an ability hitting multiple targets, including the tank. When that's not happening, you're free. You're free to change stances, you're free to change forms. In this case, many times it's going to be feral form, cat form, and just go and continue to damage, spending energy. Instead, I mentioned it does require a little bit more experience in Mythic Plus, because of course in Mythic Plus there aren't two tanks, so you have to be much more careful when you pull this off, but you still can. It is still possible, and also much easier if you do it in balance form rather than cat form. So back to the original spoiler, being that Brewmaster and Protection Paladin are the fastest tank specs. Brewmaster has the benefit of having a lot of cheap abilities they can use, on top of their active mitigation, which is one of the active mitigations that is used more often, which is Purifying Brew, which isn't gated by something like a resource, it isn't gated by energy, just by a recharge, and they have quite a lot of them over time. Blackout Kick is very easy and often used, Spinning Crane Kick is also used a lot, and over time it racks up. It is a little bit boring in the sense that none of this does anything in particular. Blackout Kick, Spinning Crane Kick, even Breath of Fire, it does feel kind of boring, but it keeps you busy. It keeps your rotation pretty busy as a Brewmaster Monk. Not as busy, though, as a Protection Paladin. Protection Paladin is by far the fastest of all of the tanks. They also specialize in haste, which just makes them even faster. The culprit of Protection Paladin's fastness comes from Crusader's Judgment. This is more used in raid encounters, more so than Mythic Plus, but trust me, in Mythic Plus they are just as busy when they change their playstyle to go and be more Avengers Shield centric, but with this one, giving them 2 charges of Judgment gives them a lot of things to press. Or if not a lot of things, the same things but a lot of times, because they get to cast a lot of Judgment. So if you want to try to play a fast spec, maybe you have played a pretty slow melee DPS, or maybe even more slowly a caster, which is the slowest of the type of specs you can play, you could try to play a tank and see what it means to go fast. You know, Protection Paladin is nearly twice as fast as an Affliction Warlock. And Affliction Warlock is pretty popular, so maybe if you've played Affliction so far, maybe switch it up and go play Protection. So after the tanks, for this video, we're looking at the healers. Because the healers, of course, are very unique to judge how fast they cast. After all, they can only cast things based on the damage your group or raid is taking. Of course, you can always cut it short and say whenever the healer isn't healing, they should be doing damage, which also makes it even harder to gauge because, you know, it's difficult. It's not a rotation. You're not following a script. You're not following a fixed rotation as a healer, so you can't exactly quantify just how much are you going to be busy. But you still can. We have enough data, we have enough numbers to actually extrapolate and see which of the specs are fast and which of the specs are slow. There is actually a very easy answer to this, a very cheat kind of way to get the properly correct answer for which healers are fast and which healers are slow. I'm gonna give you 5 seconds to think about it. Obviously, the answer is that on the fast side of healers are the specs with a lot of instant abilities. So, not casts. After all, melee DPS are faster in general than casters because they don't cast. They have instant abilities. They don't have to spend 1.5 or 2 seconds channeling, essentially, casting a single ability. They're just using instants, and for healers it's the same. The more instant abilities you're pressing, the faster you're going to be required to be for your rotation or your list of priorities. So for this answer, the clear winner is Holy Paladin. It comes to no surprise, right? Because Holy Paladin looks like this. You have Crusader Strike, you have Holy Shock, you have Light of Dawn, Hammer of Wrath, Word of Glory, and Judgment. Those are all instant abilities. In fact, why stop here? This is the entire list of abilities being used by a Holy Paladin in one of the best logs. And you can see there isn't a single casted ability. Not a single one. It's all instants in there. That's why they end up being very fast. In this case, the cheat is double. because they don't just cheat because they have instant abilities, that would be a Restoration Druid. They also cheat because they use instant abilities and they get to do damage. So a lot of their abilities aren't really gated by cooldown, resource and whatnot, because they are healers doing damage. So the Crusader Strike is easily spammable as a Holy Paladin and nets them a lot of usage, meaning they are very busy in their rotation. They always have something to do between the Strike and the Judgment and the Hammer of Wrath and their actual healing abilities, Word of Glory and Light of Dawn as finishers and Holy Shock. They are always very busy. The other one, which is just a scuffed version of Holy Paladin, is Mistweaver. Mistweaver tries to do the same thing as Holy Paladin, which is fist weaving, so doing some damage in between the rotation. They even have a specific legendary to do this, which is the Ancient Teachings of the Monastery, which allows them to heal a little bit more using their damaging abilities. They get to use Tiger Palm, they get to use Rising Sun Kick in their normal rotation, which bumps up their busy time, their amount of spells and abilities they get to use. On top of other often reused abilities like Renewing Mist, it makes them pretty busy in their cast numbers, their ability presses. I mentioned the other one, cheating, being Restoration Druid, because the Restoration Druid, of course, is one giant ball of rejuvenation. That's basically what they do. They cast Rejuvenation, and because it's instant, that nets them a lot of casts over time. It makes it seem very busy, right? However, it is likely the most boring, because that's their role. You spread Rejuvenation, you use Wild Growth, and sometimes you chunk out regrowths to targets getting low. That's kind of it. It does, though, keep you occupied over time. On a similar note, Holy Priest is there as well. Holy Priest does something similar to Rejuvenation with heal. Also thanks to the synergy with their new legendary, their rather buffed legendary, they spam a lot of heal. They have the help with some of the instant abilities like Prayer of Mending, which also makes them pretty busy over time. Circle of Healing being made instant also gives them a pretty busy time. They could be even busier and amongst the more occupied healing specs if Renew was back in the meta for Holy Priest, if they actually spammed a lot of renews, much like a Rejuvenation, but right now it really isn't. But it is still among the busy side of healers. The ones who are not that busy are Restoration Shaman and Discipline Priest. Those two specs function similarly. Discipline Priest works around their Schism window, so you have Schism, you have Radiance, you have Mind Blast, you have Penance. Have you noticed something? That's right. Those are all abilities on a cooldown. So you prepare for this window, you set up your Power Word shields, you start spreading your Atonement, then you do your whole damage window. Once that's over, your uptime goes down again. Your number of abilities pressed over time are lower than other specs that just constantly produce button presses. Restoration Shaman is also pretty similar. They have Cloudburst on a 30-second cooldown, synergizing with Wellspring on a 20-second cooldown, and the only other thing they do outside of that window is Riptide and Healing Wave. Riptide, sure, is an instant cast, they can spam, but they can't spam it as much as Rejuvenation. Healing Wave is a pretty slow casted ability, so over time Healing Wave is casted a lot, and because it's a pretty slow ability, over the course of a fight you're not going to have a lot of button presses, a lot of abilities being used as a Restoration Shaman. So that is how the healers are configured in terms of how fast they have to be played. Of course, you have to consider something I already warned you about, which is healers nowadays. This isn't vanilla anymore. Healers also do damage, so more often than not you can fill your empty time with damage abilities, which generally speaking is not going to change too much. So a Restoration Shaman, for example, or a Holy Priest is not going to suddenly become as busy and as frenetic as something like a Holy Paladin, regardless of what other things you're casting besides healing. And then there is also, of course, Mythic Plus. How busy you are in Mythic Plus is going to change because you have to add in things like crowd control abilities, hard or soft crowd control abilities, and other things, mobility abilities that you might be adding into Mythic Plus, dispels and whatnot that happen more often in keys compared to raids. But generally, this is how it looks like. Generally, Holy Paladin is going to be the fastest one, the one that's going to keep you the most busy when it comes to the rotation, followed by Mistweaver and Restoration Druid. A little bit lower you have Holy Priest, and at the bottom you have Discipline and Restoration Shaman, because of how much focused they are on smaller, powerful windows compared to just overall continued button pressing, which happens more often in other specs. So I hope this might help some people who haven't played any of these specs and they were wondering which specs to play. If it goes just beyond I'm playing the most powerful spec, period, this might help you decide This might help you get a little bit more insight on some of these specs. Probably, likely, tomorrow, I think, we're going to be going over the range DPS and the melee DPS that we haven't gone over today. This is also a little bit more in-depth when it comes to DPS, because they, unlike tanks and unlike healers, are following a script. They are following a pattern, which could almost be perfect to the second based on the rotation they have to follow. Yeah, sure, when you apply target dummy rotations to a raid encounter, it's never going to be the same, but ideally, in a perfect world, that's what you should follow. So it is much more strict compared to a healer and a tank. Not to mention there is way more specs, there is more to talk about, the video would be way too long, both for you and your ADHD zoomer 5-minute attention span, and both for me and my voice. So for now, we're going to be stopping at tanks and healers for today, to reiterate once again in our continued quest in finding the spec right for you to play in 9.1. We have gone over initially the power of the specs, then we are now currently going over how fast they play, how slow they play, how frenetic they are in terms of how often do you have to use your abilities, and then eventually we will be going over the last one, which is going to be the more fun one, the more interesting one, because of course it's up to personal preference, which is how entertaining they are to play, how fun they are to play. So for now we can stop here. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you are an Audrey Hepburn fan, you should subscribe to this channel. If you are not, then why are you watching the video? I told you already, you should not have watched this, you degenerate. See you guys soon, and in the meantime... What? Are you still here? Okay, then you should start by watching Breakfast at Tiffany's. That will be a start for you uncultured swine.